Hello, everyone, and welcome back again to Solving Basketball. In this episode, we have the first repeat guest of the podcast, and that is Gibson Pyper. You might remember him from the episode when we drafted coaches. We each picked our 5 coaches that we would want to take over a program given random talent. And now he's back. The podcast has grown a little bit. So if you haven't listened to that already, I would highly recommend it. And thank you so much for coming on, Gibson.
Thank you for having me.
We also were on Gibson's podcast just a day or two ago previewing the Duke-Virginia game. So definitely go check out his podcast as well. If you like this one, I'm pretty sure that you're going to like his. How do you think we did in that podcast previewing the Duke-Virginia game?
I got to be honest. I feel like we hit everything perfectly with a little bit of surprise. And Duke did not switch as much in the second half in the mover blocker, and we can get into that in more detail. But I feel like, the game kind of went with how we kind of predicted it would go, as in, for me anyways, like Virginia stayed in the game, and then Duke just had the 2 best players on the court.
And okay, so before we really jump into that, the first question of the podcast is always the free throw question, which you already answered in your first episode. So I have a revised question here. First repeat guest. This is uncharted territory. So in the Duke-Virginia game, Jack Salt air-banked a free throw. It actually hit above the square. Like, that's how high it was. It is pretty unbelievable. I thought he might have tried to miss it on purpose live, which wouldn't have made any sense either, but he just didn't. He just missed it. He is a 45% free throw shooter for his career and a 49% free throw shooter this season. So my question to you is, if you and him went into a gym right now in a non-game environment and he shot 100 in a row, how many do you think that Jack Salt would make?
He shot 100 in a row?
Yep.
He probably makes 78%, 78 of them, 80.
So in your experience, like a 50% free throw shooter like that, that's about what they shoot in practice?
Yeah, most of the time. I mean, I've seen guys who in practice will make, 30 in a row and then go in a game and miss 6 in a row, just mentally, or, whatever the roadblock is.
Right, yeah. And one year, I know when Dwight Howard was on the Lakers, there was some photo on Twitter of all the Lakers practice free throw shooting, and Dwight Howard was, I think, like high 80s maybe. Steve Nash was like 99% in practice. I agree when people think that they're better free throw shooters than an NBA player or whoever, there's a big difference in practice versus a game, right?
Yeah, it's not even close. I mean, you look at, the NBA players, those guys, they probably shoot better from the field in practice than most people do from the free throw line ever, and most of the time, any big guy in the NBA will shoot 85% in practice from the free throw line. They just do.
What is basketball? What is it? Is it basketball? Is that basketball? What is it? What is basketball?
All right, so that was the change-up question, the Jack Salt. We'll probably have to keep that going for repeat guests. So now we're going to dive into the Duke-Virginia game. But the first thing to talk about before we get into all the adjustments, and there were a lot of adjustments for the most part, but at the end of the day, Duke shot really, really well from 3. And so I want to talk about this more philosophically, I guess. So as a coach, do you think that, or I guess, how much does it take you to deviate from the game plan? Like, if someone gets hot, like Duke did in the first half, where guys that have shot bad percentages from 3 on the year started making shots, what is your philosophy in terms of sticking with the game plan or not?
I think as a coach, you have to ride with your game plan for at least a half, and then make a halftime adjustment. I can't remember who said it, but someone was saying like the first and second quarters in high school, obviously, are like your game plan executed. The halftime is adjustment. And in the fourth quarters, you just play your best lineup with the adjustments you made. And I think, if you're looking at Virginia, I mean, Duke went nuclear from three, and they were down, 4 at the half? Or, like, to me, that's a clear sign where it's just like, hey, like, yeah, they hit threes. What we're doing is working, though, because you're still in the game. Now, if it's a 10 to 15 point, I mean, it did get to 14 early on when Virginia was struggling from just offensively. But, I mean, if Duke's a team like Duke, if they're the best team at scoring in the paint, right, and they're going to hit threes, that's literally like you're not going to win 9 out of 10 of those games. So you have to just stick with your game plan as long as you can see signs of progress. Now, if you go down 20, if you go down, big, then you can kind of analyze, okay, what isn't working? What can we eliminate right now? But it's really hard from a coaching standpoint to be able to, like, in the middle of a game, middle of like the under 16 timeout, under 12 timeout, to adjust to something real quick on the fly if you haven't practiced or prepped with it.
So I agree with you there. I guess the one thing that we would do sometimes, and honestly, I wasn't sure if it was the right thing or not. One year out of my 3, everyone had a different like color or name for closeout. I think we've talked about it on this pod before, but the Rondo, the Wade, or the Curry or something like that. And so if a player got hot early on in a timeout, we would change our closeout onto him. And as the data guy, the analytics guy, it's a small sample size that's going on. So how about if it's, in Duke's case, it was everyone, and so that made it even harder to really make an adjustment. I guess RJ Barrett was probably the one guy who single-handedly was making more threes than he normally does. But if you had one guy who's in maybe the 25 to 30 range, but clearly like he has the green light to take them, which is the case with Duke, would you change the closeout potentially?
I don't know. The hardest part, even if you do change the closeout, I mean, RJ Barrett 6'8", Cam Reddish 6'8", Zion 6'8". Like, if your guy who's 6'4", maybe. I mean, if you're closing out on a 6'8" guy, it really doesn't matter how hard you close out, or even if you get your hands up, because I mean, and then Diakite obviously going out with the injury didn't help with some of that length, but. Like, yeah, I mean, you can adjust a closeout, but honestly, if you looked at some of the shots they were hitting, it wasn't like they were wide open. I mean, there's guys there, and sometimes with hands up in their face, and it was just like, okay, well, cool. I mean, the one that wasn't was Zion, but you're giving that up. He took one, he made one like early in the game on ISO, and you just go, okay, well, if you're going to shoot that, you're going to shoot that, and that's how we're going to lose.
Yeah, I agree. I did listen to Tony Bennett's press conference, and he hadn't seen the film yet, so he wasn't sure, but he kind of hedged a little bit, saying that a combination of Duke hitting shots and then them not getting a hand up. He said he thought they did a better job of it in the second half. I didn't think they did that bad of a job in the first half, and if we go back to game number 1, which we talked about in the previous podcast, I mean, they got hurt really badly on drives that we don't normally see the pack line get hurt with, both Zion and RJ getting relatively easy baskets off dribble drives, and they took that away in the first half. And so given that they took it away, they did at least get late contests on most of those shots. I think that this is probably a process over results kind of thing where Duke just got, like you said, went nuclear.
Yeah, I mean, Duke shot 62% from 3 and 58% from the field. Like, if you play a team like Duke that does that, I don't think any team beats Duke if they shoot 62% from 3, period.
The other more general thing before we get into the specifics that I wanted to ask you about is, so this has been something that I've thought about for a long time with coaching. Tony Bennett's system on defense, the pack line, the thing that they are really, really good at is taking away easy shots. So that's what it's predicated on, is no driving lanes, take away easy shots, get early help, get in the gap. We don't necessarily care so much if we force turnovers, and then we're going to be in great defensive rebounding position because we're in the gap. And then on offense, it's kind of the opposite. On offense, he emphasizes taking care of the ball. They normally, although against Duke they did have some offensive rebounds, they normally are not an offensive rebounding team. They're also not a transition team. Whereas, again, flipping back to defense, that's one of their biggest priorities is taking you out of your transition game. So they kind of contrast each other. Like on one hand, he's saying turnovers are really, really important on the offensive end, but on the other hand, he's not trying to generate them on the defensive end. And in a game like this against Duke, where they did give up some transition points, it shows more often than it might in a typical game. Well, what are your thoughts on that? And is that some sort of flaw or not in the system, I guess?
I think it's hard for me personally. I mean, I'm sure others don't have a problem with it, but it's hard for me personally to critique somebody who has clearly a much better coaching reputation than I do, and clearly has had more success overall than I have as a coach. They're 22 right now. The 2 losses come to Duke. The system, hasn't won a national championship, but has had postseason success, ACC success, and one of the best leagues in college. I can't really sit here and say, well, he's not a good coach or a flaw in the system, because the system works. Like it's proven he's winning at the highest level, competing at the highest level. With that being said, from a philosophy standpoint, I definitely don't agree with either of the concepts of the pack line defense or his offensive philosophy. Just because, the pack line's great, but one of the problems with the pack line is it allows for ball reversals and it allows for 3-point shots, basically. And if you look at, the past, 5 NBA champions and the past 5 college champions, most of them are really good 3-point shooting teams who try to reverse the ball. So it's like where we're seeing the game going, because we're trickle down effect from the NBA. Right now, the most elite offenses in the NBA are almost 5 out, shoot a lot of threes, and shoot a lot of layups. And most of those threes are coming from drive and kick, or players are just really good in isolation. So that is a direct recipe to defeat the pack line, in my opinion. You look at what kids are going to emulate these days is Harden, right? They're seeing Harden put up these ridiculous numbers. He's stepping back. I can guarantee you, if you walk into a Lifetime gym right now and you watch young kids take shots, half of them are going to be step backs when they're messing around, because they see Harden do it. They see Steph do it. They all want to shoot, and that's what everybody wants to play like. And then from an offensive standpoint, you would think if your defense is elite and it works, you would design your offense to beat your defense, right? That's like you were saying, that's the contrasting part, right?
Yep.
So it's like, why? And we saw UMBC really, really have great effectiveness last year when they drove and kick, and they were able to drive the pack line and drive and kick for threes, and really kind of were really hard to guard when they went 5 out and when they went smaller and they had shooting. So it's like, he is going a little more toward that European ball screen motion like we talked about. But, really, they don't run it at a fast pace. They don't drive and kick. They drive and dish. They play slow. It works. But for me, I just don't, and obviously every coach is different, but I just don't think that I would set my offense up and my defense up to not kind of work together. Because what you'll get is, in practice, it's probably a little weird when they go 5-on-5, because they're not really, their defense isn't going to make their offense do anything different. And then their offense isn't going to make their defense do anything too different, because it makes it easy to guard both of them.
Yeah. So, well, first of all, I agree with your initial point that, in that coaching draft that we did, he was my number 1 pick. so clearly,
Yeah.
But for me, the best thing that Virginia does is the execution of their system, not necessarily the system itself, which probably a little bit harder to evaluate as an outsider, because we're not at practice every day watching them teach and implement the different concepts. So it is a little bit harder to evaluate, but usually in almost any Virginia game, they play Tony Bennett's style of basketball at a really, really high level. And that's another part of coaching beyond just, I guess, picking pack line or denial or whatever the case is. And then, I mean, Bo Ryan was another one. They never turned you over, but he was obsessed with not turning the ball over. And that always just seemed strange to me. But at the end of the day, it's your points per possession. There's different ways to get there with the 4 factors. So you can, like in Virginia's case, you can be a great defensive rebounding team and balance out some of that turnovers a little bit. So that's, I guess, from a bottom line perspective, that's how they win. But it's an interesting thing to think about for sure, like what you really value, I guess, as a coach.
Yeah, and it's, I mean, obviously, I think also being part of a coach is you're influenced by who you coached under, right? So, I mean, obviously his dad was, mover blocker and played that deliberate style. So it makes a lot of sense that, Wisconsin has continued under Greg Gard, the same kind of philosophy. So, obviously I'm still a young coach, so I'm still developing how I want to play. But I look at what's fun for my kids, especially at the high school level. You're not going to have Division I players, Division II players every year. So I try to design a system that's fun to play, fun to watch, win or lose. We can go home and say, hey, we had a fun game.
So let's get into the chess match or the adjustments that went on in the game. And let's start out with when Duke had the basketball on offense. We talked about in the pregame podcast on your podcast that Coach K in his press conference in game 1 mentioned that they put a little bit of a weave in. We both kind of agreed that it wasn't a huge factor. I think you said they only ran it 3 times in game 1 when you charted it out. Were there significant adjustments? Like we said, the big story on that end of the court was the 3-point shooting, but what were the tactics, I guess, that went into that?
Yeah, so they didn't run very much weave action again, not surprisingly. They started off the game.
First play, right?
Yep, first play, they definitely ran it, and then they didn't run it pretty much anymore after that. They actually did not run a lot of, like last game when they matched up, they had more 4-out kind of drive stuff. This game, they really didn't run a ton of just like the 4-out drive. It was a lot of like 4-out and then just pass the ball and shoot because they were making every shot. But what they tried to do more of this game was post up RJ and post up Zion in their offense. They ran a couple of sets for it. When they ran the sets, it wasn't like complicated. It was literally just like set a little lazy screen and then post up Zion and RJ because they're bigger than the Virginia players. But not a lot of that dribble weave action like we kind of saw in that first game, which I expected to happen because Duke never stays with their offensive adjustment after maybe 3 possessions, no matter what game they play, because they have more talent. So like they just don't need to. And that is a super interesting contrast with, how Virginia does what they do. They're very rigid and execute everything like we talked about on defense and offense. And Duke just kind of like floats around and they're like, we have the better players, so we're going to keep it as simple as possible and let them go make plays.
Yeah, it's a huge contrast in that regard, which I think I have some examples of Duke kind of just floating around and doing what they want on defense and still getting really good results too. In the first half, Duke only had 5 2-pointers, and I had 3 of them in transition, 1 of them on a baseline out of bounds play, and then Zion did have 1 drive in half-court offense. He made the basket, got fouled. And so that was 1 2-point basket, basically, against the pack line, which, well, if you didn't know anything about the 3-point shooting, it would have seemed pretty improbable that they gave up 1 half-court 2 and were down 4 at half. In terms of just the gap defense, which was a problem in the first game against Duke, that was much more improved, right?
It was so much more improved that I had to chart out how many paint touches Duke got, because I was like, I don't remember. I mean, they got into the paint. When they did, they would see bodies, right? I mean, I didn't really remember any time besides maybe a couple of drives where they got in and they had a clear cut layup. I took away transition. I basically kind of made it where, like, if the pack line was set up and was able to defend, at least not at a disadvantage, right? So they had at least 3 guys back, Duke wasn't attacking, 2-on-1, things like that. I had 52 possessions of them where they were kind of set up in their what I would call the effective pack line. Duke had 18 paint touches for the game.
Wow.
Like total out of all possessions, they touched the paint 18 times, and I consider a paint touch, like 2 feet in the lane with the ball secure, not like the ball floating around offensive rebound, things like that. So 18 times Duke touched the paint. And when they touched the paint, they didn't really have a ton of success. It was kind of split hit and miss. Like I think it was 6 turnovers, 7 turnovers, and like 2 and 1s, and then a couple of misses. And it's like it was very mixed results. Now the weird thing is when Duke came down and had no paint touches, that's when they made most of their threes. Like they would just come down, drive to just a little into the gap, a little overhelp or even just a little help, and it would be a kick, and then Duke would make a three. So to me, like if you look at that as a coach, like if I'm Tony Bennett and I'm sitting there looking at these stats, if they chart these out, you're going, we're doing what we're basically what we're doing on offense is our defense is working. What they're doing on offense is just working better because they're making threes.
I think that it goes back to our initial talk about, do you change the game plan or not? And with those numbers in hand and watching the film too, I mean, I think you can make a good case that Virginia's game plan was right. They just didn't get the results they wanted. I noticed, I'm not sure if you charted this or even just noticed it, but there were some more ball screens from Duke in the second half, I thought. Trey Jones split a ball screen for a floater. They hit Bolden on a roll against the hard hedge. I think it was Jay Huff in the game at that point. And then they did have a shot with 2 on the ball, kind of, an RJ Barrett 3, where I think Hunter didn't really help that much off the tag and got a hand up, and RJ still hit it. But it seemed like down the stretch maybe they went to more ball screens. I don't know if that was on purpose or not.
Yeah, so what they did was the last basically 6 to 8 possessions in like the second half, after they'd already hit all the threes, they went to spread ball screen basically every time. And I think the reason for that is just a threat, in whether or not it's your defensive system or not. Virginia's defensive system against the ball screen is the hard hedge, usually the low man tags. They're in good gap help anyways, so it's not a big deal. Well, in their heads, you could see that they're one step closer to every 3-point shooter, just because in their mind, you got to be thinking like, okay, they've hit all these threes. I know we're allowing that, but I got to be one step closer. And then maybe even said that as a coaching staff. If we go, we play pack line in our high school. If someone hits a 3, we basically say, hey, you got to take one cheat step over towards them, just so we can get a quicker closeout and make them think there's more bodies there. And then so when Duke went spread ball screen, the first one they actually hit, Trey Jones was open on like a fill basically on the wing and right into a post up for Bolden, where he got the deep seal, caught it, and finished it. That was the only time he actually didn't travel all game when he had the ball. And then the next time Trey Jones was handling, he split, got a floater. The next time after that, they found Bolden on the roll, wide open. And then the next time after that, they found RJ on the wing, like you were talking about, where Hunter did fall asleep a little bit, but was still able to recover and should have contested better. But it was just like, it was I think it was a very important point that Duke made, where they said, look, we've been hitting threes. Let's just put them in spread pick and roll and see what they're going to take away. And it was like a progression of, it's like, okay, they took away the roll, we hit the wing, we post up. They took away the wing, so we hit the roll. They take away the roll, so we hit the other wing. Like it was a very simple progression of basically Trey Jones knowing how a ball screen works.
That's a great point. And it goes back to what we said in the first podcast, where you have to pick your poison with Duke. There's no perfect game plan. And that's another good point about the giving up threes in the first half. If you do decide to then get out on those 3-point shooters, then it opens up other things. And it could open up dribble penetration, or in this case, ball screens that then lead to threes anyways. I guess it's a really high level offense playing a really high level defense. And generally speaking, and not in every game, but over the course of a large sample, I think that the offense is probably going to win more times than not. Do you agree with that?
Yes, and which is why I love when people say defense wins championships. Because, sure, it gets you there. But in my opinion, I think offense wins championships because, literally Virginia played the perfect game defensively, in my opinion. They did not foul a lot. I think, Duke, they shot 20 probably free throws, but, you got to think, 10 of those were at the end of the game when they were fouling. So really they held them to, let's say, 12, 13 free throws the whole game. They closed out. They were in the gaps. They prevented drives. You can see they only had 18 paint touches all game. And for me, paint touches and ball reversals are a pretty good indicator of what a good offense is going to end up at, whether that's through the post or a drive, however that ball gets there. And so, when I was watching it again this morning, you're like, man, Virginia did everything right, except they just didn't make as many shots as Duke,
Yeah, I guess if I was trying to critique something, I guess maybe defensive rebounding in the second half. They gave up a free throw rebound that was pretty big, but then just defensive in the first half, it didn't really bother them. I guess it's because Duke made every shot. But that would maybe be the one thing. And even a couple of those, like I remember Zion getting an offensive rebound and Ty Jerome hit him and was holding his box out still. So like they were still doing the technically correct thing on most plays, which is the sign of a Virginia team, of a Tony Bennett team.
Yeah, and it's like there's just some things you just aren't going to be able to do, and one of those things is box out Zion. Like you're not. You can make contact, but all you can do from a coaching perspective is basically say, did we do everything we were supposed to do in the order we were supposed to do it, and it still didn't work? Well, you know what? They were just a better team.
And all right, so that's a good segue into the other side of the ball. So when Virginia had the ball, this was the side where there was a lot of adjustments in game number 1, and we were interested to see what would happen in game number 2. So for those who aren't familiar, I guess, with game number 1, Duke decided to switch 1 through 5, which effectively took Virginia out of their normal blocker-mover offense for the most part, and they switched to a lot of continuity ball screen and isolation in that first game. So, let's start with give me a brief overview of what happened in Game 2 strategically.
I think it was a search for answers. To be honest, that's what it looked like, because obviously mover blocker is their identity, and that's what they opened up the game running. I think 8 straight possessions of it. The problem was to begin the game, it wasn't really that the mover blocker wasn't working, because the first probably 10, 15 possessions as a coach, you're trying to read and evaluate what the other team's doing defensively from a scheme standpoint. Like, are they going to continue to switch? Are they switching 1 through 4? Are they going to mix up the coverages? How are they going to guard this? Well, it's hard to evaluate that when, 3 out of the first 6 possessions have a steal and a dunk for Duke, when you can't even get into your action, and Trey Jones is stealing it, Zion's stealing it, Cam Reddish is stealing it, and you can't even see what they're going to do because you can't get past that point of attack. So that really stood out to me, where it's like that's why they kept going to that mover blocker early, because you just don't know. You still have to see how they're going to guard it, because it might be viable later on.
Yeah, that's a good point. So they couldn't even get into it to decide if they wanted to keep running it or not. That definitely makes sense. The numbers, so I charted Virginia's offense, and I have 28, the final numbers, 28 possessions of continuity ball screen. They scored 33 points off of those 28. And then 17 possessions of the blocker mover, which Tony Bennett calls sides, I think, or at least Jay Billis says he does. Sides. So 17 possessions and just 9 points in those 17 possessions. Like you said, there were several turnovers there that were somewhat unrelated to the action itself in the offense. And then I also have, and we talked about this in text, I have 13 possessions of what I just labeled middle third, which I think is another part of the blocker mover for the purpose of my work. It's not sides, basically. It's everything. The reason why I call it middle third is everything's in the middle third. So we talked about this. Well, first of all, how often does Virginia run that in a normal game from what you've seen, and why do you think that they ran it 13 times and scored 14 points off it? So it wasn't quite as efficient as the continuity ball screen, but it was pretty close.
Yeah, this is the most I've seen them run it. Just like in a game for possession wise, usually you'll get 4 to 5 possessions of it just to give the defense another look, or maybe after a timeout, come out and look, maybe get like a back screen or some of those quick down screens. I don't personally know if it's from the mover blocker or not, and I believe Jay Billis when he calls it sides because he does his research. Like I was at a coaching conference where he spoke at, and I got to kind of talk with him a little bit. And he showed us his prep work he does for each game, and it is so crazy in depth. I couldn't take a picture of it because he didn't want us to, but it is so in depth that I believe that he knows everything that he's talking about. Anyways, but yeah, it's just weird to me. I think it's unnatural, I guess is the right way to put it. It seems easy to guard, like you would just stand there, but then Duke had a hard time with it when they went to it. So I don't really know. I'd have to go back and look at all the film that I have on it and see how effective it actually is. But I guess it's a decent option to kind of throw in the middle of a game where a team has prepared for, your mover blocker and then the Euro ball screen, and then they have to go to guard that. I don't really know what to think of it, to be honest with you. I'm still processing it, even though I've seen it before. So yeah.
Another thing that we talked about is that in all of Tony Bennett's offense, and he has been adjusting more and more, even we can get to this in the ball screen stuff. I noticed a couple almost like counters from yesterday's game, but all three, the continuity ball screen, the middle third stuff, and then the side stuff, it's all continuity. It's all what we were talking about, where this is what we're going to do and we're going to execute it at an extremely high level. Whereas Duke, there's a ton of randomness going on. They like you said, they run a couple of sets. That's a very simple action. But then from there, it's mostly have good spacing and play. On the flip side, it's a trade-off. Virginia is really, really good at their execution, but as a defense, it's coming. So do you think the lack of randomness hurt Virginia against Duke?
I don't think the lack of randomness. I think the lack of playmaking for others really hurt Virginia. I mean, you got to think, they do share the ball well. I think their assist numbers are okay. But as far as like, if you switch Bolden onto pretty much anybody on any other team, you got to think that they have one guy who's going to be able to take him at any time they want. Some quick guard. I mean, somebody somewhere would have somebody to exploit Bolden switching onto them one-on-one on the perimeter. And I mean, late in the first half, Kyle Guy did score twice in a row on it, but that's it. I mean, I don't remember ever Bolden being put in a situation where he looked really uncomfortable. Now they took him off the floor a little bit and played Zion at the 5, which was great to see. But I'm not impressed with Virginia's ability to create one-on-one. So having a continuity is actually probably not a bad thing for the type of players and the type of situation that Virginia is going to be in. And I had one of my players actually was recruited by Virginia a little bit before he committed to Rice. And I kind of asked him, I said, hey, when you guys recruit, what kind of guys are you looking for? And he basically said, disciplined, strong character guys. That was their goal. I mean, obviously they have to have skill for sure, and that shows because that's literally how they play all the time. And we kind of talked about Duke's undisciplined kind of actions on defense, where one pump fake and Zion's jumping in the air. Zion's gambling for steals. He'll give up points because he's trying to get a dunk in transition. And so that's how a team like Virginia stays with a team like Duke. Is they're just a steady hand, right? Where they're just going to keep coming back. They're just going to keep coming back. They're just going to keep run what they run. don't do anything bad on defense and don't do anything bad on offense. We're just gonna be steady and keep coming and keep coming and keep coming. And I'm sure that gets annoying to guard and be against if you're coaching against that.
Let's get into Duke's defense a little bit. So the play that went, I guess, viral on Twitter was that, and you tweeted about it too, was that Zion block. And so what happened on that play was they were in continuity ball screen, so they set an empty side ball screen, and Zion was guarding the ball. He was guarding the guy coming off the ball screen, and they had a late switch. Like it was sloppy. That's how I would describe Duke's defense in most cases, as sloppy. And so he stayed with his man for like a second or two, and then realized that he had to go switch. And by the time that had happened, they had thrown the pocket pass. I can't remember who it was. It might have been Jay Huff, but not positive on that. So they threw the pocket pass. Zion's behind because he should have been the one guarding the pocket pass. RJ Barrett then steps up and does the right thing in that case, because they were going to give up a dunk, and he steps up at the midline basically to as a help defender, and that's when Zion runs across the court. They skip to RJ's man in the corner, and he blocks that shot. And that's like the perfect example of the Duke defense right there. It was actually earlier in the game, RJ or whoever was in that spot didn't step up, and they gave up the dunk a couple times. So it was, I guess, better than their normal rotation, but they have such large room for error with the athletes on the floor, right?
Yeah, there was nothing that was more perfect than that possession to describe everything that I noticed with Duke defensively. Like, they didn't execute very well. Virginia got, what they wanted, and then all of a sudden, like, Zion just comes out of nowhere and throws it into the sixth row after when I think it was Hunter right in the corner who got the ball. Yep. He caught the ball in the corner. Zion was still basically in the restricted area, like 2 feet in the restricted area when he caught the ball, and ended up blocking it into the sixth row. Like, it was when it happened, I audibly was like, what? Like, it was unbelievable. And like, that just sums up perfectly like why Zion is so special. I mean, I understand it was a low pass. People are saying a little better pass. Sure, whatever. Maybe. But if you think about it, if I pass the ball out to a college player and they catch it at below their knees, and the defender's in the paint, 9 times out of 10, that's an open 3-point shot. Just because the defender he may get there late, but that's not enough of a contest to probably throw the shooter off. And Zion basically blocked it almost as it came out of his hands. It was unbelievable. Unbelievable is the only way to describe that.
And you had said initially you saw Duke in person against Army this year, and I still think that obviously a play like that really shows it, but there are other smaller plays where you just can't, on film anyways, you just can't quite grasp the length and athleticism that they have on defense, even though if we're just talking about from what a coach would want them to do in terms of coming together on the switches and being in the right spot on help defense and all that type of stuff. They aren't great at it, but they play pretty hard. They have really, really good length and athleticism. And then the other thing I noticed, especially during their runs, it was kind of quiet in the arena, and they were talking pretty good, especially on like the switches. I would hear them yelling each other's names, and so the talk was pretty good. There were 2 other examples beyond the Zion one that I wanted to make note of, that it's not just him that do these kind of freak plays. One was like Reddish on a switch, got ducked in. I think it might have been Braxton Key by Braxton Key, and was just totally on the side of him, and Key went to lay it in, and Reddish just had a ridiculous on-ball block. It was very close to goaltending, but again, he's a guy who isn't always in the right spot at all, but he just makes up for mistakes. And then the other one was in the blocker mover, and you had said that it was hard to see how they were guarding the blocker mover, if they were good or not because of the turnovers. And this was like the one example I was like, oh boy, I don't know, maybe they should stop running this. It was Trey Jones was guarding one of the pin downs, and Zion was guarding the blocker basically on the pin down, the guy setting the screen. And Trey Jones got lost on the play. He was like 2 or 3 steps behind. It should have been a switch. Zion didn't even really realize it. And so correctly, the Virginia player curled into the lane. Trey Jones wasn't sleeping. He was just behind the play, basically. Zion was kind of asleep. But because he's there, Virginia doesn't want to go up against him, and then they go into their boomerang action following the pin down, expecting you to jump to the ball. And Bolden was the guy who was guarding the boomeranger, and he had terrible footwork. He turned his body the wrong way. He jumped to the ball like late, not on the flight of the pass. And then he still is long enough where he was able to recover. And so like all 3 guys were playing suboptimal defense and no shot for Virginia.
Yeah, that's a problem. You know, if you're a coach and you're going against that, I mean, how do you even like tell your guys, hey, like shoot? Because I mean, they basically just swallow you up when they make a mistake. That's what the weird part is. It's so overwhelming, like when they're not in the right position that you think you're open. And even Bolden, when he gets switched out or he's recovering, like he's not that athletic and that mobile, but like he looks like 5 times bigger than Kyle Guy on the screen. I mean, obviously I'm not in person. I mean, and those guys are big, but like he just looks like he swallows guys up. And so just their ability to, and what I think a big part of their defense, what makes it work with that switching is they all like each other. You know, you can tell that they like each other and they have fun, and it's been documented that, you know, they're all friends. But like when you like the person that you're playing with, you're going to call out a switch. You're going to let them know what's going on. You're going to talk to them. So that's half the battle when you switch is just talking about it. And you could hear, you know, when they go under the rim, when they're running kind of like floppy entry, you could hear them calling switch, talking about it. And, you know, like you were saying, so if you like the person that you're working with, it's going to be more enjoyable and you're going to work harder. Like if Zion Williamson did it like his Duke teammates, he would not have blocked that guy's shot in the corner. He wouldn't have even tried because he in his mind, he could convince himself that he wasn't supposed to go out there and switch and recover. And so that to me, I think stands out more than anything else is it seems like these guys like each other enough to make up for other people's mistakes.
Yeah, so like there's a buy-in there is how I would explain it. There's a buy-in. Is that all that Coach K should be trying to do with this team? Like put the offensively or defensively. On the offensive end, we've talked about how they don't run a ton, they have good spacing and they go. On the defensive end, they kind of fly around and figure things out. What do you think? Obviously, at least 3 of these guys, maybe more, are only going to be here at Duke for this 1 year, whereas Tony Bennett, for the most part, is getting multi-year guys and really building the system out. Is there a scenario where you think you could take Zion Williamson, RJ Barrett, Cam Reddish, Trey Jones, and have them in the right spot on every play with precision, like a Tony Bennett team?
I don't know if I'd even want to do that. Because I think the biggest problems that I have with a lot of coaches at the next level and at the high school level is when you have a ridiculous athlete, I always tell my guys who are good athletes, just go be an athlete. Like I'm not really worried about technique. I'm not worried about how you do it. Just do it. Just figure out a way to get from point A to point B. So they don't make the shot, so you can test the shot, so you get the rebound. You know, I mean, that's kind of where we talk about the results for Virginia, about how they get there. They just get the results. Well, they get there very methodically, execute, do everything with precision. I mean, I think Duke's kind of doing the same thing. They just want to get the results, but they just want to let their guys go be athletes. And that's what, if you have Zion in Virginia's system, it would be wasting his talent, in my opinion. I mean, think about it. Where does he fit in Virginia's system? Does he fit? I mean, will he be the screener and mover blocker in Euro? Like, I mean, really, you're going to take the best player in the nation, best athlete that college basketball has seen in a very long time, and have him be a screener? So that's where, and obviously, I don't know if Virginia's getting those guys. They have a very precise system of how they're getting guys. Like the recruits that were at their game. I know pretty much 5 of those guys. I've seen them play in North Carolina. I know who they're recruiting. I know the type of players they're recruiting. They're not Zion. They're not the top guys, which is great. Like that's their system. That's how they're doing it. And that's fine. But for me, if I have Zion, RJ, and Cam, and even Trey Jones, and I'm looking at those guys and I'm going, I want to control this. Like, no, you just go let your guys be guys. Go let the athletes take care of the athletic things. And I think that's something that a lot of high school coaches don't do, is they try to control their athletes. They try to control some of the guys where, I think you should just let them go be whoever they can be, as long as they're doing what you're saying. Like as long as you set the expectation of, I want you to go get me a steal every possession, be aggressive, and just establish that in their own mind. As long as they know what your expectations are, I think you have to let them go be an athlete.
Here's something that I think is interesting. What do you think a Duke film session is like? Because on that Zion block play, there were things that were technically wrong that would normally be pointed out in a film session. Really, of those 28 possessions of continuity ball screen where they scored 33 points, there were, I'd say, at least half of them were just like wide open shots. Either Clark hit a 3 in the corner off one, Jay Huff got a dunk off one. If you just watch the possessions that Virginia scored on, you would think that Duke's not a very good defensive team, because they gamble and inevitably you're going to give up some open shots. They had on those switches in the first half. We didn't talk about this. They had some high-low action against the switches for little lob passes over the top. So how would you balance that out with your team? That the results are good and you don't want to limit them, but you also want them to grow as a player too.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest quotes that I've learned as a coach is, it's not what you preach, it's what you tolerate. So, obviously Coach K is giving them a lot of freedom. So I think in a film session, you can't sit there and say, like, Zion, you do this, you do this. You just have to kind of pick the one thing offensively and the one thing defensively, where it's like, hey, if you want to win a national title, we have to do this every possession. And that might just be talking. That might be something that they're enforcing, in practice every day, is say, hey, if we just talk through everything, we can make up for some of these mistakes. So obviously, for me in a film session, my biggest thing would just be the general positioning, right? Like you can't, if it's great hustle for Zion to do that, but if you have a better overall position, it doesn't allow Virginia or any other team to do anything they want. So when it comes tournament time and you play a team like Gonzaga, who is going to exploit you at every single level, right? I mean, everything that Gonzaga is going to do offensively, and they already exploited with Duke, they're going to continue to do that. When you play a Villanova, like teams like that, they're going to be smarter than you and be able to hit shots at your level. What is going to turn us into an elite competitor for a national title? And that's, I mean, not in their film rooms. I don't know what Duke's enforcing, but I think you just have to choose one thing offensively and defensively for them to be elite at, and then go from there. And then it's not what you preach, it's what you tolerate. So if that continues to happen in a game where, although Zion made a mistake and then got an amazing block, well, maybe in a film session we say, hey, look, if you're doing your job, you don't have to do this. Which it's really hard to convince somebody that goes viral that that's not the right thing to do. But
in that vein, then, if you had one thing to really focus on the offensive end, so you said you already talked about the defense, but one thing on the offensive end, let's say over these next 10 games for Duke, nothing major, but just something that you feel like will help them win a national title, what do you think that would be?
In my opinion, I think it's getting basically when you get a paint touch and drive in, instead of double clutching and going through 2 or 3 guys, if you're Zion, RJ, whoever's driving, I think finding extra kickouts and then relocating, just making the 2 or 3 extra passes, I think will be extremely important when you get down in deep NCAA tournament run. A lot of those teams, they're going to have guys who can guard, one-on-one. So what's happening and what kind of happened in the second half with Zion when he was driving in and he was seeing bodies, he didn't force up any shots, which was great, but he also had some sloppy turnovers. So if you can teach them, hey, look, I understand that you can drive by anybody. When you get in there, if you see an extra person, don't be afraid to kick that thing out and then relocate. Just get the defense moving just that one more pass, two more passes every possession, and then get a second paint drive. That's when Duke would be basically unstoppable.
That makes a lot of sense. Lastly here, let's try to put these teams into context with the whole country. So now Duke is 21-2, Virginia is 20-2. And obviously, these are two of the best teams in the country. You mentioned Gonzaga, who I think is really right there with them. They just announced, I believe yesterday, that Killian Tilly is out for the regular season. They hope to have him back for the postseason, but they've been pretty darn good without him. He would definitely help quite a bit. But you watch a ton of Michigan, I know, and really just a lot of basketball. So if you had to tier it out at the top. Obviously, Tennessee is the AP number one. I'm looking at KenPom right now, and Duke is 1. Gonzaga is actually 2. Virginia 3. You've got Michigan State, Tennessee, Michigan, and Kentucky all in there too. Ignoring that, what do you see in terms of like a tier for national title contenders?
Yeah, I think Duke is alone at this point. And the reason I say that is because they'll always have the two best players on the court. We kind of talked about that before the Virginia game. If you have the two best players on the court in Zion and RJ against anybody else, your chances of winning just go up. They just naturally are going to be higher than everybody else's. So I think Duke is in a tier by itself, not by a lot, because you see some really good teams and it's a one-game tournament, right? You lose one game, you're done. So who knows? But I think Duke is in a tier by itself. After that, I would probably have to go, I don't know. I'm not really convinced with Tennessee. I don't know. I haven't really seen I did a full breakdown on what they do. I really like what they do. They run it Davidson's offense, but I'm not really buying, I think they'll tell me more when they play Kentucky, this next Saturday. I think it'll tell us a little more about who they are, because they've obviously only lost to Kansas, but Kansas is not what Kansas was then, if that makes sense. And so I'm just curious to see what they do this weekend. So I'd probably say Duke. The next tier would probably be Gonzaga, Michigan, Kentucky, North Carolina. And then after that, maybe like Michigan State, Virginia, Tennessee, teams like that where you get kind of in the lower tier. After that, I don't really know. Kansas and Villanova are always sneaky because they're well coached and they know how to make deep playoff runs, tournament runs. But I think that's kind of how it shakes out for me right now.
Yeah, I pretty much agree with your tiers, although I would have Virginia higher still. I think they're 20-0 against not Duke. I guess win-loss can sometimes be a little bit deceiving depending on how dominant you were in those wins. Yeah, I think that even though the game yesterday clearly showed there's a really big talent discrepancy in terms of just pure talent, I have been saying this all year long that Virginia has more talent than people think. Ty Jerome, to me, was the guy who really sticks out more so than DeAndre Hunter, even as a guy who definitely belongs on the floor regardless of what system you're playing. If regardless of the Tony Bennett way, Ty Jerome can just play, and then you always have that defense there with you. A team that I would like to see do. So you talked about Gonzaga and Villanova as offenses that can really capitalize on some of Duke's undisciplinedness, I guess. Purdue right now they're fourth in adjusted offensive efficiency, and having watched them, they put people in really tough situations, and they have a lot of shooting on the court too. They don't play defense at a high enough level to be in that top tier, but I would like to see a team like that, or Villanova or Gonzaga, play against Duke.
Yeah, so I do all the Michigan breakdowns, so I've seen Purdue, and they can give Duke a lot of problems just because they're freakishly hard to guard. That's the way I put it. Like they put you, every possession is basically a battle for, are you going to take away what they're going to do, or are they going to do what they want to do? And most of the time they do what they want to do, and they either get a good look or they make a shot. So that's an interesting team. I think one team that we overlooked or are still overlooking, and I don't know how to evaluate them, is Nevada.
Yeah.
They have, they have 5 guys who can play on the perimeter. They've got a lot of talent. They play it at a good pace. I mean, I just don't know. I don't know what they are yet. They haven't really. I don't know. I've watched them a couple of times. I just can't figure out. Obviously they're not playing the competition that some of these teams are. And then also with Virginia, what I really want to see is who they are over this last couple weeks of the season. And the reason for that is because you look at their schedule. So they just played Duke, right? They go at UNC, at Virginia Tech, at Louisville, at Syracuse, and then end with Louisville. So like those are 5 really tough games, and with 4 of them being on the road. And then playing Duke UNC back-to-back I'd be so mad at the ACC schedulers. But I just think we're going to learn a lot more about who they are over the next 2-3 weeks.
Yeah, no, I didn't even realize all those road games, especially. So KenPom has them finishing 14-4 in the ACC, which would mean 6-2 over that stretch. So it sounds like you might be thinking that they would finish worse than 6-2.
I think so. I mean, it's just so hard. I mean, winning on the road by itself is really difficult. So I mean, if you finish and you're basically playing out of those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 games on the road, you're playing 4 against ranked opponents. Like that's hard. Now, I will say this: I don't think the ACC is as good as everybody thinks they are. I think it drops off pretty significantly after the first 3 or 4 teams. But I do think winning on the road in a tough environment against a ranked team, no matter what I think of them, is very, very difficult. And I'm not saying they can't do it, but and then it's not guaranteed that you're going to win at home either. You've got some sneaky teams like Notre Dame. I don't think that's a bad matchup for Notre Dame. Like Notre Dame is a solid team and reminds me a lot of, if you took Virginia and modernized what they do on offense, I think that's what you get in Notre Dame. The methodical, except the only thing Notre Dame does is they go 5 out and spread you out and go spread ball screen and look for shooters more. So I think if you modernize what Virginia does from just like a execution standpoint, I think that's what you have in Notre Dame. So I think that's a really tough game too. So you're going, Duke at UNC and then Notre Dame, then at Virginia Tech, and then at Louisville. That's a really tough 4-game stretch in itself. Not to mention you got Syracuse on the road, which always is super weird for every team because they play that 2-3 zone with length. So I just think we're going to learn a lot about what Virginia is going to be coming up.
Any last words on the Duke-Virginia matchup? They could meet again either in the ACC tournament or the NCAA tournament.
Yeah, I hope they do. First of all, I really hope they do, because I think Virginia will go away from the mover blocker earlier and they will have a more prepared game plan. And I don't think Duke will hit those threes every single time against Virginia. I mean, obviously they haven't in any game this season before, really. But I think, what Virginia did defensively worked. What Duke did offensively worked better. So what I think we're going to see in the next matchup is basically Virginia doing the same thing they were doing, really emphasizing taking away those driving lanes and making Duke beat them from 3 again. And what I think we're going to see from Duke is just tightened up communication on those switches. But I think we're going to see Virginia attack more in ISO, especially if Bolden gets switched out onto Guy or Jerome, and really make, because what happened in a little bit in this game was when they got the high-low stuff in that Euro ball screen, you could see Trey Jones was switched out on different players. So Trey Jones and Bolden are on the floor. I don't think they're going to switch as much, which is where Virginia can go back to their kind of mover blocker stuff and force those switches or exploit the high-low action if they do switch. So it'll be interesting to see how they adjust in the future. But I think Virginia's got a really good chance, and it's really hard to beat a team 3 times in 1 year.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time. Tell the people where to find your podcast and where to find you on Twitter too.
Yeah, I'm at Half Court Hoops on Twitter. I do a lot of breakdowns, NBA and NCAA X's and O's. I also have YouTube. That's Half Court Hoops. And then I have my website, thebasketballplaybook.com. And the podcast is the Basketball Playbook Podcast.
And like I said earlier, definitely check that out. I was listening to one yesterday with a shooting coach. I can't remember what shooting coach did you have on?
Dave Love.
Dave Love, yeah. If you are a basketball fan, definitely there's some pretty good guests on there and just X's and O's content. Yeah, definitely go check that out. So thank you very much, Gibson.
Thanks for having me on, Jordan.
No hand checking Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, Tony Kukoc.